Yeah, you ready? Hello, I've been sent some questions on the subject of listening books, and I'll do my best to answer them. And our first question comes from Fern. Do I have a favourite word? It's interesting, isn't it? I'm often asked this, and I think a lot of people have favourite words, or at least they have groups of words that are favourite words. I like words that are very Anglo-Saxon, that could only be English. Words like, I don't know, trundle. It's a nice word, isn't it? Trundle. Trundle along. Suggests kind of wooden wheels somehow. You almost hear them. It's not onomatopoeic. It doesn't really sound like a trundle, but it's so specifically hooked to a sort of wooden-wheeled thing that it almost evokes the noise as you say the word. And it just couldn't be German or French or Italian, could it? Trundle. Wonderful word. Thank you. I have a question here from KK Lebu, which is a fantastic name. Who would you cast as Jeeves and Wooster for a new series? Oh, for those who are not familiar, I did back in the 80s and early 90s, I think, just with my friend Hugh Laurie, a dramatisation of P.G. Woodhouse's wonderful stories about Bertie Wooster and his man, his valet, his gentleman's personal gentleman, Jeeves. And that was a fun thing a long time ago now. And there is indeed talk of a new series of Jeeves and Wooster coming, I heard. Who would I cast? I think as someone like, as Jeeves, someone like Stephen Mangan. Do you know the actor Stephen Mangan? I think he'd make a very good Jeeves. He makes a very good everything. He's a terrific actor. Mark Gatiss would be very good as well, I suspect. But for Bertie, that's a really difficult one. Hugh Laurie had just the right quality of ineffable stupidity to play it brilliantly. But there aren't many people born as stupid as Hugh every generation. You know? They're very rare. Joking, of course. I have a question here from Anne. I heard you say one shouldn't use the word hopefully as it isn't grammatically correct. Please, can you tell me why? I'm sure I never said, Anne, for a minute that hopefully isn't grammatically correct. It's a question of whether it's semantically correct, which means, is it correct in meaning? If I'm hopeful, it means I'm optimistic. So if I say, hopefully he will come, it really means, semantically, that he will be hopeful when he comes. Happily he will come. In a good mood he will come. He will come hopefully. It's an Americanism. It's really not important, but it goes back to the wave of American immigrants who came of German immigrants who came to America in the 19th century. And they have the German word hoffentlich. And they kind of translated it into English as hopefully. What usually one saying hopefully, what one actually means is I hope. I hope it'll be a good day tomorrow. Hopefully it'll be a good day tomorrow. It's slightly wrenched the original meaning, but I don't care. And if I said that, I was being very pompous and absurd, because actually I don't think these rules apply. Where there's any possibility of confusion, one might worry about these things, but nearly always when someone says hopefully, they mean I hope. Or I am in hope that, or we are in hope that. So it's not a big deal, and I'm very sorry if I confused you. But it's not a grammatical error at all. Question from Bill here. As a fellow bullying victim in my youth, I understand your advice to mitigate things by using avoidance and words when you can. But given the current state of the world, and now that we're older, doesn't our response to bullying have to change? That's a really, really difficult one, Bill. It's very hard to negotiate your way out of a bullying situation when you're young, when you're outnumbered, when you're not confident. You can be made to feel just awful. And of course, there are new weapons in the bully's armory now. Vicious tweets and remarks on Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook and all the other social media outlets can cause young people to feel immensely isolated, upset, and not just young people either, driven to self-harm and at worst suicide, as we know. We've all read stories about that. And it's all very well to say, water off a duck's back, laugh at them, and so on. It isn't easy, I know that. I personally think it is up to all of us to try and to have antennae for those we like or have responsibility for or live with, for parents to think about whether it's possible that their child is being bullied or some way attacked online or shamed or humiliated or mocked in ways. Children have immense pride, and as we know, it's heartbreaking but true. They so often think things are their fault, which aren't their fault, whether it's abuse of any kind. They so often store it up and they don't tell their parents, which is, as I say, heartbreaking. And I think we have to look for the signs, in the same way that parents in my youth were always told to look at their children's pupils for signs of drug use, as it were. I think it is worth just trying to open the conversation with people. Say, are you happy? Are people treating you badly? And just find a way to give them permission to reveal what's happening to them. Because, yes, it's all very well to say that you can engage or mock or use wit or humiliate and turn the energy of a bully against themselves, but it's never as easy as it can sound. But it's a very good question. Thanks, Bill. I have here a question from Derek. As a person who is registered blind and gains a lot of value from audiobooks, I've been inspired to try my hand at writing. Do you think antidepressant medication will dull my creativity? If so, would I be better served writing non-fiction whilst on this medication? I see, writing non-fiction rather than fiction. That's a very difficult one for me to answer because, of course, I don't know what medication you're on. I know it's a great worry for those of us who do and have taken medication for mental health conditions. We're very afraid of losing a sort of edge and a spark in our mind, and when it comes to writing or indeed just socially engaging, we fear this sort of chemical zombification. The only answer is to search, your doctor or your psychiatrist, whoever your health professional is, and ask them what they think the effect is on the mind, and also, obviously, gauge it yourself. One wouldn't want to risk anything by going off medication without consulting and, really discussing it with a doctor. But it's not a bad idea if you do find that you've not got the sort of juice and pep to write fiction, to turn your hand to non-fiction. Maybe the way to start is just to begin with a diary, a very detailed, emotional, full diary in which you can use all kinds of things, humour as well as emotion, to describe your day and your feelings, and see how much you can do that under your current regime of medication. But it's a wonderful question. Thank you. I have a question from Veronica here. What's the thing that made you the happiest in the past month? Golly. Well, I'll have to be honest. It sounds like I'm doing an advert, but I finished my book that I've been working on. I've been over the last year and a half, 2 years, working on a trilogy of books on Greek mythology. I wrote one last year called Mythos, and I finished about a month ago one called Heroes, which is the second in the trilogy, and the third one will be about the Trojan War and its aftermath. And there is no greater feeling of satisfaction than finishing a book. And actually, coming a close second is finishing an audiobook, and I had the inestimable pleasure of listening to a reading of Bleak House, the Dickens novel, one of my very favourite ones. And I finished that about 2 weeks ago. And that actually almost made me sad because I was enjoying it so much. So I'm thinking at the moment about what big book to read next on my walks, i.e. to have read to me. So those things make me happy. What else? Oh, I won the lottery, £1.2 billion. I changed my name and pretended I lived in South Carolina. But that caused me a bit of momentary passing pleasure. We have a question here from Fern. Do you plan out what you're going to write in advance, or do you start to write and see what happens? That's a really good question, and one that interests a lot of people, and indeed all writers are interested in other writers as to whether or not they plan out. Some, I know, do to great detail as to what each beat, as the word is often used, of a narrative, each sort of twist and turn of the plot. They know exactly what's going to happen and which chapter it's going to be. I'm not like that at all. The great artist Paul Klee once said, when talking about how he made a picture, he said, I take a line for a walk. And sometimes I do that. I just simply take a line for a walk, not necessarily a line of dialogue or a line of description. It can be like a narrative line, a thought. Someone is doing this. You see someone and they're doing that, and you just start and see where it goes. And the beauty of the technology that surrounds writing these days, the different sorts of writing software available to one, means that one can have the various rough outlines and sketches and chaptered thoughts that went nowhere all around one, all available like pieces of paper on a huge floor, but inside a piece of software. There are various kinds like Scrivener and Ulysses and so on that are dedicated particularly to writing, which you may have come across, and there are others too, of course. And I think, if you picture Michelangelo, say, is a famous example of a sculptor, and his David is probably the best known sculpture there is. Now, when he, if you picture the foot of the David, say, just perfect human foot, it's absolutely incredible, every toenail. And he didn't start off on his piece of marble. He didn't say, I'm going to have a perfect toe, work on the toe until the toe was perfect, and then the next toe, and then the next, and then slowly build up a foot, and then up the leg. He roughly cut bits and shapes out. And in the same way, a lot of sculptors who work in clay, they get a whole load of clay, and they make a rough human shape, and then they go in, and then they go in, and they refine, and they refine. And I think it's the same with writing. A lot of people say, oh, I started writing, I couldn't finish it. And usually what they've done is they've written this perfect opening to a chapter, which is like a perfect toenail. And then they've thought, oh, where do I go next? Whereas maybe the best thing to do is just to put down as many words as you can, like a great wodge of clay. And then you can always come back and refine and refine and refine. But it's a wonderful feeling just getting the words out. They don't have to be perfect. They can be rubbish, but they're just filling in the gaps as you canter forward and you start to define your stories and your characters. That's a long answer, but anyway, I hope it's of some help. Everyone's different. Here's a question from Davy. What was the first book you read that really left a mark? That's a joke about bookmarks, but it's not, is it? The first book I read that really left a mark. Well, I suppose if you say I read rather than I read with my mother or my mother read to me, what would that be? I would say the first book that really left a mark, that actually made me want to write and made me wriggle at the astonishment at the thought that language could behave in that way, was probably when I was 10. I was given a collection of P.G. Wodehouse short stories called Very Good Jeeves, which is my introduction to the character of Jeeves. And it wasn't so much the character of Jeeves or even the character of Bertie Wooster or any of his friends. It was the prose, it was the writing. I had never known that you could write with such freedom and such grace and brilliance as P.G. Wodehouse wrote with. It made me realise that the fact that I was non-musical no longer mattered, because you could do things with language that musicians could do with music. You could make it sing, you could make it enchant, beguile, seduce the ear, make people happy with it, make people laugh make people smile, make people feel a great sense of peace and joy just through the procession of one word after another in the service of a sentence, and then the following sentence, and the gathering of sentences into paragraphs, and the gathering of paragraphs into chapters and longer sections of narrative. This suddenly all came together with Woodhouse. And before that, I'd read, like, most British children of my generation, I'd read Treasure Island and Alice in Wonderland and, Winnie the Pooh and all those things, and I'd loved them. I particularly liked the poetry of Winnie the Pooh. I loved the rhythms. James, Morrison, Weatherby, George Dupree took great care of his mother, although he was only 3. Mother, he said, don't go down to the end of the town without consulting me. And I sort of just loved the fact that there was something about that rhythm which was liberating. Again, possibly because I was non-musical, it was the only way I could get it. And yes, I used to sort of chant Robert Browning's How They Brought the Good News from Ghent to Aix, I sprang to the stirrup and Joris and he, I galloped, we galloped all 3. And I'd sort of go through these like they would be my equivalent of songs. But it was really Woodhouse that lit my fire. Here's a question from Abby. Abby. Now, was it more difficult to read the later Harry Potter audiobooks after they became such a worldwide phenomenon? That's a very interesting and intelligent question, actually, because it obviously from that when it started, I started working with Joe Rowling and the audiobook people on Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It was the only book she'd written. And she wasn't famous, and Harry Potter wasn't famous. It was a children's book, and it was just a normal gig for me of doing a children's audiobook, except that it was longer than most. It was about 85,000 words, which is a good adult length. And I read it, and I thought, this is jolly good. And when I finished, Joe Rowling said to me, rather sort of shyly, she said, well, actually, I've written a second one. It's called Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Good for you, I said. That'll be a big success too, I'm sure. Little knowing, I don't think I sounded quite as patronising as that, but of course, little knowing what was going to happen. She didn't know. No one knew that, because it was an unprecedented propulsion into world fame and penetration of the Harry Potter, image and brand, as it were, that had never been seen before, really. It had been seen perhaps in Charlie Chaplin and Disney and, and a few other, or the Beatles, you might say, where, by the time the 4th book came out, it was literally the lead item on the BBC News that evening, that at midnight the book was coming out, and the cameras went to different bookshops around Britain, showing children queuing up for that midnight hour. Now, this had never happened before. The publication of a new book in a series, being the lead story on the 9 o'clock news, it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary for Joe Rowling and for Bloomsbury, who published her, and for me and for everybody involved. Nothing like this had been known. And obviously it did make it slightly more difficult, because had I known from the very beginning, I think I would have sat down and I would have worked perhaps much harder on each character and giving them a separateness, but maybe that wouldn't have been such a good idea, because the thing about audiobooks, I think, is that, when you read a book, if you do read books, you don't want every other word to be a different coloured ink. You want to lose yourself in the book. The print melts away, and the membrane between the print and the page and the story and the author and the characters melts away, and you're inside it. And it's the same with an audiobook, I think. If it's too much, every character being fully rounded and accented and having a totally different voice, then the reader's ear tends to go towards what the actor is doing rather than being inside the story. You no longer want to hear the actor's voice. You actually just want to be inside the story. So maybe it would have been a mistake. I would have embarked upon it as if it was too important a life's work. Oh my goodness, I'm going to be the voice of the biggest literary franchise in history. Probably would have maybe too self-conscious. So perhaps it's a good thing that I just went at it like a normal book. But it was a very exciting ride to be on, I must say. it was very important to Jo Rowling from the beginning that the first book and then the subsequent ones, when they went to audiobook, should not be abridged, condensed or shortened in any way. She felt, perhaps rightly, I think, that a lot of children who were beginning to read and who would be listening to the audiobook might be following it in print as well with their finger running along and if there was any difference, they'd be kind of confused and annoyed because children like things to be right. And this meant that obviously I had to read, the woods must be would, not should, and so on. All those little details must be correct. And as so often happens when you're reading a book, you get a phrase that for some reason your mouth just doesn't want to know about. And this was a 3-word phrase. Harry pocketed it. See, I still can't say it. I still put extra syllables in. I can say Harry, and I can say pocketed, and I can say it. But when I say Harry pocketed it, I still get like that. Anyway, I was doing this on, I think, the second or third book, The Prisoner of Azkaban, I think it was the third book. I was going, Harry pocketed it. Oh, damn, can we go again? Harry pocketed it. Oh. So at lunchtime, I said, we'll leave it, park it there. At lunchtime, I called, she wasn't in at the time, I called Jo Rowling up and I said, look, I know I'm supposed to say everything exactly as you wrote it, but would it be okay if instead of Harry pocketed it, which I can't say, could I say Harry put it in his pocket, which I find very easy to say? She gave a pause on the phone. I thought, why is she pausing? And she just went, no. It was like torture. And do you know what? In every single one of the subsequent books, she put the phrase Harry pocketed it in the book. So every book, I knew it was coming somewhere. I was cursing her. Anyway, that was a little private Easter egg for me. Thanks for the question. Here's a question from Fern again. I think, unless it's another Fern. So Fern wants to know, if you could time travel and meet an author in their own time, who would you choose and why? Oh, goodness. Well, it's tricky because you want to avoid the obvious answers, don't you? I mean, clearly it would be amazing to meet Shakespeare. Apart from anything else, just to get a sense of whether he knew how great he was. You do get a little bit of a sense of the fact that he was aware. Excuse me, I mustn't touch my microphone. You do get a sense of the fact that he was aware he was a great, great poet from his sonnets. In his plays, his voice is obviously less personal than in his sonnets. And so I'd just like to sneak into a tavern somewhere in London, where I know he was fond of a pint or so, because his friend Ben Jonson wrote about that. So you'd go to his tavern, and you'd slip next to him, and you'd say, oh, it's Will Shakespeare, isn't it? The actor, writer. And they go, yes, it is, yes, because he spoke, presumably in a slightly Midlands accent, because he came from, Warwickshire. So he sounded a bit brummé, probably. And he'd say, Will, so your plays, do you think people will be performing them in, after you're dead, perhaps? Well, that'd be ridiculous, of course not. No, that's crazy. Or he might say, yes, they will, and they will in 1,000 years' time. But I'd just love to know, if you are as great, as imponderably, insanely great as Shakespeare, do you know it? Or is there always that feeling, like with Van Gogh, who never sold a painting in his life, that maybe you will be, as the poet Gray puts it, a flower that is born in the desert and wastes its fragrance in the desert air, i.e. there's no one there to smell it. There must be great writers all over the world, you feel, potential Shakespeares who've never had the opportunity. But it would be just wonderful to go back. As I say, just slip next to him in a tavern and offer him a drink. Just find out. Here's a question from Arthur. Is there any hope for an expanded or maybe a second volume of Mythos? This was my absolute favourite read of the year. Arthur, you could not have said a lovelier thing. It's always nice to hear that books are a favourite read, and I'm able to say, yes, I have done a second volume of Mythos, which I've called Heroes. If you remember, Mythos covers the sort of the birth of the gods and the creation of the Titans and the Olympians and the Muses and the nymphs and their first interactions begins with mankind created by Prometheus and Pandora, of course, coming down. All of those things was in the first one. The second one is devoted to the heroes. I use the word heroes as a sort of gender-neutral word, so it's not just Heracles and Theseus and Jason, but also Atalanta, the huntress, Medea and Phaedra and all these extraordinary women as well. And it's one of the great things about Greek myth. It has almost a timeline. You know, you get from those early days through to the heroes who are often children of the gods. You know, they'll have one god as a parent and one human as a parent. And then I'm hoping next year or the year after I'll complete the trilogy with the third volume, which will cover the Trojan War, the extraordinary Achilles and Odysseus and his journey home and all of that, which sort of ends the contract of the gods and man in Greek myth, and the modern age begins. So it's an unusual mythic world, the Greek one, because it has that perfect timeline. So thank you, Arthur. Here's a question from Katie and Patricia. The audiobooks you have recorded have helped many adults rediscover the art of storytelling. Well, thank you. Do you enjoy performing the books as much as we love listening to them? And do you plan to continue recording audiobooks by others? Thank you for being patron of our lovely listening books. Well, thank you, Katie and Patricia. I do love doing audiobooks. I mean, I sometimes think, well, you know, when I was at school, I saw other boys and girls. Well, it was only boys. I kind of pretend there weren't girls. There weren't girls at my school. Why would I pretend it when there weren't? So I saw the other boys, and some of them were brilliant at cricket and at football and at rugby, and some of them could paint, and some of them played musical instruments and sang and ran. I couldn't do any of those things. I couldn't paint. I couldn't draw. I couldn't play a musical instrument. I certainly couldn't sing without causing people to put their hands over their ears and shriek. I couldn't really run in a straight line. You know, I'd usually end up colliding with a tree. Couldn't catch a ball, couldn't throw a ball. I had nothing but language, nothing but stories. They're the only things that I had that I felt I could do something with. I could tell them and I could read them. I read from a very early age, and I was writing by the time I was 3. So, and I would write stories for school friends and things. And I loved, because it was a boarding school, and I was very young, you know, when I was sent away when I was 7. So, and so you'd be in these dormitories, and one of the ways you'd sort of fight homesickness was reading, but also I would get under the bed with a torch, and I would read to the rest of the dormitory. So I've been reading audiobooks, in a sense, all my life for over 50 years, because I used to do that all the time. I used to read Alistair MacLean, who used to write thrillers. That's what we liked at my prep school. Ice Station Zebra and HMS Ulysses and Where Eagles Dare. Stories like that. That's what I used to do. And yeah, it's a nice feeling. You're in a glass booth. There's a microphone. There's what used to be your pieces of paper. Now, fortunately, it's a tablet, so you don't have to make the pauses for the paper noises as you turn a page over. You can now just silently slip through page after page. Although you would be disgusted to see how much spittle ends up on the surface of the glass after a day's work. It's quite worrying. And yeah, there's a producer, you know, engineer in the other side of the glass, making sure you're saying all the right words, and you just get lost in the story as you tell it. I really enjoy it. It's a wonderful thing. I enjoy doing my own books, and I enjoy doing the books of others. It's a time thing, though. I did all of the Sherlock Holmes stories, the entire Arthur Conan Doyle canon of Sherlock Holmes stories, which is 4 novels and 5 books of collected books of short stories, which is a huge, over 70 hours of reading. But I was like a pig in Chardonnay. It was wonderful. Enjoyed it hugely.